What is up, everyone? Welcome to a new episode of Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Daima podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Tim Bridgewater. I'm back with another episode. It has been a little bit of time now. A little bit of time has passed since the previous episode. If you're someone who has not had a chance to listen to those previous 2 or 3, I'll just give you kind of a short rundown of what this is now. Basically, I made a realization some time ago that if you guys were going to take the time to write me an email, the least I could do is take the time to come back and record an episode where I respond to your email. Okay. And it had been a while since I'd gotten one, but I got another one that came in. So here I am. And that's really, it's really that simple. I just want to, I'm doing this just to say thanks to anyone who comes along after the fact, sits down, types out an email, cares enough to write me because maybe you just stumbled upon the podcast, and in the case of this email that I have today, it seems like that happened, and I want to give you guys a chance. So even if you come along later, you still have a chance to interact with the podcast and ask me a question. I got some emails after my previous podcast ended, which was, of course, Rock the Dragon, a Dragon Ball Super podcast. And by that point, the podcast had ended. So I felt a little bit bad that there were people that were discovering the podcast after the fact that never got a chance to really interact with me. Okay, so you don't have to worry about that in this case until further notice or unless otherwise discussed. I'm going to continue this podcast as long as I have content to talk about. So make sure you stay subscribed. Okay, so you still have a chance to send me an email. So for our email segment, which of course is called What Are You Saying? You can send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. As we continue to do this, it's okay if the topic shifts a little bit away from Dragon Ball Daima. Obviously, Dragon Ball Daima was only a 20 episode series. I largely did not care for Dragon Ball Daima. There's not a ton to really discuss specifically pertaining to that show. So I am kind of opening this up to more general Dragon Ball topics and maybe even something a little bit non-Dragon Ball related if it comes up. But we would like to keep it mostly Dragon Ball related if we can. So if there's something you'd like to say, questions, concerns about anything, go ahead and send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for you guys who have stayed subscribed. I know it's been a very, very tricky time, and Dragon Ball Daima is a very tricky show, and thus I have a very tricky podcast. But I knew this was a possibility when I started it, so it's all good. So with that being said, I have a new email here from Aaron, and I'm going to read Aaron's email. Okay, so Aaron writes, "First off, I wish I would have discovered you 10 years ago. You're saying all the things I've been thinking. Awesome. Bluff." Okay, so Aaron, I actually had to look this up. I had to look this up. It's an acronym, BLUF. And I had never actually heard this acronym before, so I had no idea what it meant. Okay, so I had to Google it. And so it turns out that BLUF stands for bottom line up front. So basically, it's almost kind of like a TLDR sort of a situation, right? Sort of, but you're saying that, hey, here's the bottom line. Okay, your email says, "I need advice on what, where, and how to start watching again, if at all. Daima seems like it may not be really worth it, and I have Netflix. Let me start by saying I've only seen Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, backwards at that. While playing college football, there was this odd marathon of movies on Cartoon Network in about 1997, but it was mostly during practice or film times. I recorded it on my dorm VCR, Tree of Might and whatnot. I then mailed the entire set of recordings, 4 VHS tapes, to my older brother. Now he's hooked, by the way. I liked the movie so much that I tried to buy the entire series. Pricey. I finally found one that I could afford at the time. I accidentally bought Dragon Ball for a great price. It also ended up being the entire Dragon Ball series in Japanese with English subtitles. Even today, I can understand a little Japanese. I didn't know this at the time, but there are almost 100 more episodes in Japanese than dubbed in English. When I spoke to people about it, I was talking about things they hadn't heard of. They thought I was crazy or lying. Anyway, I managed to keep going and watch all of Z twice. Then I simply got busy with life and felt like I was out of touch. Now I'm seeing blue hair and yellow fur all over the place and I have zero clue what's going on. That's why I'm so stoked to hear your podcast. I may switch to YouTube to watch along. To make a long story short, or to make a long story less long, if I'm to start watching again, where should I start? I hope this finds you well, and your next vacation includes a sandy beach in Jamaica with a nice drink in your hand at sunset. My wife surprisingly kidnapped me for our last big trip. Aaron. Aaron, first of all, wow. I say this all the time, but my mind is always blown when I have a new listener that, well, maybe you're not a new listener, but when I hear from someone for the first time, and just unexpectedly, because I hadn't done a podcast episode in probably a month or so. And, you never know if things are going to continue or not. I'm hadn't thought much about it. I'm thinking, hey, if someone has something to say, I'll come back and record a new episode. And that's all I've ever really thought about it. And here you are out of nowhere with an email. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you taking time to write in. So let's take your email here, section at a time. First thing you say is that you wish you would have discovered me 10 years ago. I don't think I was talking about Dragon Ball in a podcast sense 10 years ago. I forget exactly how long ago Dragon Ball Super started, but of course, obviously, I was doing many more things before that. I had other podcasts and things like that. So yeah, that would have been very cool. But you need advice on what, where, and how to start watching again, if at all. Daima seems like it may not be really worth it, and you have Netflix. Okay, and this will kind of touch upon a lot of what you're mentioning here, and that is where you should pick up again with watching. Okay, so according to your email, you have watched Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. You just watched them you watched Dragon Ball Z first. Okay, that's kind of like me as well. I feel like most of the North American viewers probably saw Dragon Ball Z first. I don't think that that's a stretch, right? Because Dragon Ball Z was obviously, without a doubt, the bigger show out of the two. And Dragon Ball, and I do believe there was a dub of Dragon Ball that aired in North America before Dragon Ball Z. But I don't think it ever got through the entire series. I don't think it certainly wasn't Funimation. I don't know who did the dub, but I think I do remember that there was one. But obviously Dragon Ball Z was the one that really caught fire here in the early 2000s on the Cartoon Network, right? And you mentioned Cartoon Network, that you saw some of the movies, Tree of Might, stuff like that, right? The World's Strongest was probably another that was on. I do remember that they, what was the Garlic Jr. movie? Is that Tree of Might? Wait, no, sorry. Tree of Might is the one with Turles, right? Maybe The World's Strongest is the one I'm thinking of, or maybe it was just called, sorry, it wasn't Garlic Jr., it was Garlic Senior. Okay, let me just stop there because I'm getting way out of off balance here. Anyway, but yes, so all of those movies, I'm sure you have very, very fond memories of that time. And you mentioned that this was in 1997. Ooh, okay. So I'm not sure if that date is accurate, but I don't remember exactly. I remember watching Dragon Ball Z when I was about a sophomore, junior in high school. So that would have been in the early 2000s. So, I'm not entirely sure if that date is accurate, but, that's kind of besides the point. So there was a Dragon Ball dub, if I'm not mistaken, but obviously Dragon Ball Z is what got all of us hooked, right? So it makes perfect sense to me that you would have seen that first, because I saw that first as well. And then once Dragon Ball Z was popularized, I believe then they went back and they did a whole dub of Dragon Ball using some of the same voice actors from Dragon Ball Z, right? And this is how we got Stephanie Nadolny as Kid Goku, because she had already been voicing Kid Gohan in the Funimation dub of Dragon Ball Z. So then they just decided to let her do the voice of Kid Goku in the dub of Dragon Ball, if I am not mistaken here. And if I am, someone can, you guys can just let me know. So it makes perfect sense that you would have watched them backwards. Now, back to your question here. Okay, so it's not entirely clear, like, how long has it been since you watched Dragon Ball Z? Have you watched that in a while? Because I would recommend that you just go back and watch that. Okay. First and foremost, just go back and refresh your memory on Dragon Ball Z if it's been a while since you've seen it. Because you said you've watched Z twice. I'm not sure how recently that is. I've seen Dragon Ball Z probably 30 times, from start to finish. But I'm a little bit of an extreme fan at this point, right? And I'm probably exaggerating a little bit. I don't think it was 30 times, but it was certainly, more than twice. So I would just start there. I would say if you have not watched Dragon Ball Z Kai, I would say, go check that out. That is, of course, a version of Dragon Ball Z that is fillerless, where they cut out a lot of the extra filler episodes that the standard Funimation dub had. It is supposed to be more closely aligned with the sub version, so the Japanese version of the show, and more aligned with the manga. So at the very least, if you just rewatch Dragon Ball Z but watch the Kai version, you're getting a different experience. Even though you're getting the same story, it is different in certain ways, and it's worth watching just to see the differences. I didn't prefer Kai. That's just me personally. I have my own personal sort of connections with the original, sort of Funimation run of it, for nostalgic purposes and all those kinds of things. But you can start there. Now, you mentioned seeing a lot of characters with blue hair and stuff like that. Okay, so it sounds like you haven't even watched Dragon Ball Super yet. Okay, is it safe to assume that? Because if you're confused about the blue hair, then you haven't watched Dragon Ball Super. So there's an entire other series called Dragon Ball Super that is a sequel to Dragon Ball Z. Okay, now you also didn't mention Dragon Ball GT in here. So I'm assuming you haven't seen Dragon Ball GT either. Sounds as if you just only have seen Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. Well, man, you've got 3 other series to catch up on then. Okay, so you have Dragon Ball GT, Dragon Ball Super, and Dragon Ball Daima. Now, where should you start? It's kind of up to you, because there's the chronological answer. And this is a question that a lot of people who are watching the Star Wars movies have to answer for themselves, for the first time as well. It's like, do I watch them in the chronological order that the story takes place in? Or do we watch them in the order that they were released? And that's kind of up to you. I'm not sure how much you know about Dragon Ball GT. Dragon Ball GT is largely not a great show. It's not a great series. It is largely looked down upon by a vast majority of Dragon Ball fans. I don't think it's a stretch to say that, but there's no harm in watching it. I mean, there's some things in there that you could enjoy. Okay, just keep in mind that one takes place after all of this other stuff. So if you want to sort of keep in some sort of chronological order, then I would recommend just going with Dragon Ball Super, right? Because you've seen Dragon Ball, you've seen Dragon Ball Z, and you can do you know what? Let me back up a little bit. Technically, Dragon Ball Daima happens before Dragon Ball Super. So if you're going to go chronologically, the next thing you're going to want to watch is Dragon Ball Daima. Now, should you watch Dragon Ball Daima? It depends. I do not care for Dragon Ball Daima. And I know it's kind of weird because I have a whole podcast dedicated to it, but I was only able to get through 10 episodes of the show before I got sick of talking about it because it just wasn't very good. However, it's only 20 episodes, right? You mentioned the fact that you have Netflix. It is on Netflix, but it is currently still only the subbed version, if I'm not mistaken. Which you may prefer that, because you mentioned here that you watched pretty much all of Dragon Ball in Japanese. So if you're someone who's used to that, then that may be fine for you, and then you don't have to pay anything extra to watch Dragon Ball Daima because you already have Netflix. Now, if you prefer to watch the dub, I'm not sure how to get the dub now outside of Crunchyroll. I use Crunchyroll to watch the dub. Now, if you want to get Crunchyroll, it's about $5 a month, or maybe it's more like $7 a month. I forget, but it's super cheap, and you can just get it for 1 month, and you can watch Dragon Ball Daima, and then you can cancel it, right? Because it's only 20 episodes. Is it worth watching? That's really up to you to decide. I mean, I don't regret watching Dragon Ball Daima. I just didn't like it. You know what I mean? I didn't really enjoy it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that I just really didn't care for. And I won't spoil anything for you in case you haven't listened to me talk about any of that or you don't know what happens. But yes, there are transformations and hair color transformations and things like that that could be considered important to the canon. So I would recommend watching Dragon Ball Daima just so you can be caught up with everything. I will say this, watch everything Dragon Ball. You know, I'm not sure if you watched any of the newer movies. Have you seen Dragon Ball Super's Broly? Have you seen Dragon Ball Super Superhero? It sounds as if maybe you haven't watched any of that. Just watch them all. Because to me, there's no reason to not watch them all. I mean, if you're clearly a Dragon Ball fan because you've seen Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, so there's no reason not to watch any of them. Okay. So I feel like I'm kind of losing track here, but as far as the next thing to watch, it just depends. You can make your way through Daima. The truth is that you don't have to watch Daima to understand what happens in Dragon Ball Super because they barely tie into each other. Okay, but I would definitely recommend you watch Dragon Ball Super. I mean, Dragon Ball Super was not perfect by any means. I feel like it was about 50% good and 50% bad, but I did cover it for 2.5 years on my previous podcast. So if you decide to watch Dragon Ball Super, you have a whole other podcast that I did, and I can take you through every single episode of the show, you know, so you can have that as sort of a companion piece if you decide to watch Dragon Ball Super. Okay, so I would definitely recommend watching Super because, like I said, it's not great. It's not as good as Dragon Ball Z by any means, but there's a lot of good in there and there's a lot of bad. But the good news is that it kind of balances out. I mean, for every 2 or 3 bad episodes you get, you might get 1 or 2 good episodes, and then you may get a couple that aren't great, and then you get a couple that are pretty good. Unlike Daima, where basically episodes 3 through 18 all pretty much sucked, in my opinion. So that's a harder watch. But with Dragon Ball Super, you know, you can kind of, and they've gone back and since they've fixed some of the animation problems with Dragon Ball Super, so I would imagine that Dragon Ball Super will be an easier watch now. So just to kind of reiterate here, you have options. You can watch Dragon Ball Daima, you can watch Dragon Ball GT, you can watch Dragon Ball Super. If you're trying to go chronologically, the next thing you're going to go with is Daima, then you're going to go with Super, and then you're going to go with GT. Okay. And then the movies, you know, there's Dragon Ball Z, Battle of Gods, and Resurrection F. I would watch those just to see Dragon Ball with a big budget. Okay. But they retell those same 2 stories in Dragon Ball Super. So you don't need to, it's kind of confusing. And I know I'm kind of all over the place because I haven't podcasted in a while, but you have options. Okay. I would recommend watching everything that has been released, but don't go out of your way. You know, don't spend a ton of money. I wouldn't necessarily buy any of these things. If you have streaming services, if you get Crunchyroll, Dragon Ball Super is on there, Dragon Ball Daima is on there, Dragon Ball GT is on there. I'm pretty sure GT is on there as well. So you can honestly get a subscription to Crunchyroll for 2 or 3 months, watch them all, just get caught up, just to catch all the good things that happened, and kind of make up your own mind about how you feel about it. All right. Now, there are a couple other things in your email I kind of want to touch on here, so I'm going to jump back in here. Let's see. One of the things that I thought was interesting about your email, and I didn't fact check this or anything, but you mentioned that you didn't know this at the time, but there are almost 100 more episodes in Japanese than dubbed in English of Dragon Ball, I believe you're talking about here. And if that is true, which I'm going to trust you and take your word for it here. I did not fact check this, but I didn't know that. I didn't realize that the sub version had more episodes than the dub. Okay. And that makes me a little bit curious. Was it, what exactly was cut between those two versions? Was it all filler stuff? I mean, it would have had to have been filler, right? So that's interesting. I didn't know that because once again, as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, is that I have not watched Dragon Ball, the entire series, as it currently stands. Yeah. Okay. So you also say, okay, you mentioned here that you may switch to YouTube to watch along. I assume you meant watch along with the podcast. Well, there is no video version of this podcast. It's all audio. And so this specific podcast is on YouTube as well, but it's just audio. It's not a video. Okay. So that may be confusing for some people. If you type in the name of my podcast, a YouTube channel is going to pop up. You may see some videos there. There's no actual active video. It's just the same audio podcast being put on YouTube. So if you prefer to listen on YouTube instead of, Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then that's fine too. So yeah, I hope I answered your question there. And I really appreciate your last statement here. It says, I hope this finds you well and your next vacation includes a sandy beach in Jamaica with a nice drink in your hand at sunset. My wife surprisingly kidnapped me for our last big trip. It's funny that you mentioned that, Aaron, because I don't know if I mentioned this on the last episode of this podcast, but I recently went to Mexico for the 4th of July. And I don't think I mentioned that. So it's kind of, it's funny that you mentioned that because the last vacation that I took was not to Jamaica, but it was to a sandy beach. And I did have a drink in my hand at sunset. With my girlfriend and 2 of our friends. So that was great. And I appreciate the well wishes. And that's just a really nice thing to say. So I appreciate that. And I hope the trip that you and your wife had, the one that she surprisingly kidnapped you for, turned out very, very well. And I hope you guys are safe and happy and everything's great there. And I certainly want to thank you again for giving me a reason to come out of pseudo retirement once again with this email. So if anyone else has anything you'd like to say, send me an email at rockthedragonpodcast@gmail.com. Aaron, I hope that helped you out. I know it was a little bit all over the place. That's just kind of my, I don't sit down and make notes and draw outlines and all this shit like other podcasters might do. Because the truth is that like, I don't make any money or anything doing this. So I don't want to, put too much stress on myself to do it. But I hope that everything that I said there would help you out. And you kind of know where you should pick up at. So that about does it for this episode, guys. I told you I'm totally down to come back with shorter episodes from now on, just kind of reading your emails and hearing your thoughts about certain things. So with that being said, until the next episode for Rock the Dragon Podcast, I'm Tim Bridgewater. I'll see you guys next time. Keep on rocking the dragon.